Leaders from 3 EU countries, the Czech Republic, Poland, and Slovenia, traveled to Kiev today to meet with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in a show of support for independent Ukraine. But this meeting takes place under the backdrop of a besieged capital as Russian forces continue their fierce missile assault on the city. And I'm joined now by CBN News senior international correspondent George Thomas, who's on the ground in Ukraine for an update on the latest news. George, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Hey, Joseph, thank you so much for having me on the broadcast. Great to be with you.
Well, we are grateful for your time. Your perspective is so valuable to all of us who care and are praying for the people in Ukraine and praying for a quick resolution to this. Are there any recent developments that you think signal which direction this conflict is heading?
Well, I mean, I think you have seen in the last 24 to 48 hours a dramatic escalation, especially as Russian forces hone in their targets on Kyiv. Yesterday, actually this morning at 4:10 a.m., I was awoken to 3 huge explosions. I'm living right on the west side of Kyiv, probably about 10 kilometers from downtown Kyiv, and the explosions were huge. It shook the building that I was in. And then this morning, you're looking at the video here, one of those missiles exploded right on this multi-story residential complex. The reporting is that the Ukrainians managed to intercept this particular missile, and the result was that the Russian rocket missile fell and exploded right here, and you see the complete destruction of this multi-story building. I think what you're seeing is, or incidentally, Joseph, I should say, that the mayor of Kyiv has imposed a curfew, which started at 8 p.m. local time and runs till Thursday at 7 a.m. And he said that we are expecting in the next few hours a really dangerous period here in Kyiv. And so in the Kyiv Oblast, which is basically another word for province, nobody is allowed to leave their homes or apartments unless the air sirens go off, and you have to go and find shelter in an underground bunker. But basically it's lockdown till Thursday morning at 7 o'clock. But what we have seen in the last 24, 48 hours is an escalation on the part of the Russian forces. And I'll give you a picture. My sense is that, there is frustration in the Kremlin that the sort of military operation hasn't gone according to plan. The idea was that they would take Kyiv, the capital city, within a 24 to 48 hours. That hasn't happened. And they are, in some cases, bogged down, both on the western side as well as the eastern side of Kyiv. However, at the same time, I think the world's attention is obviously focused on Kyiv. When is and if would Kyiv be completely taken over by the Russians? I will caution your viewers to say, listen, the Russians are making some significant military advances, both in the south as well as in the northeastern parts of the country. Today, for example, in the strategic port city of Mariupol, close to about 400 people are in essence being held hostage by the Russians at the Mariupol hospital. That city has been pummeled in the last week. It reminds me of the scenes from Grozny, Chechnya, during Russia's horrific military campaign there. We're also seeing, the advances in the Donetsk and the Luhansk regions in the eastern part of the country, as well as in Kharkiv, and then obviously down in the south in Kherson. And there is some reporting that Russian battleships are steaming toward the strategic port of Odessa. And why is that important? Because 65 to 70% of the imports that come into Ukraine come in through the Black Sea, and 65% of that comes in through the port city of Odessa. And so if Odessa were to fall in the hands of the Russians, that would be a significant blow to Ukraine.
George, the escalation you described that you're seeing there in Kyiv, Do you think that's a reflection of persistence by the Russians, or is it desperation?
Well, I mean, I think in the West, the narrative obviously would be to say that this is a sign of desperation. But look, this is a long slog. I'm sorry to tell you this, but this is a long slog. And the Russians, just based on their history, are willing to take that long slog. You see it in Georgia. In their invasion in 2008, you saw it in Syria, you saw it in 2014 when they took a good chunk of the eastern part of Ukraine. What we are seeing today is because they are struggling from an on-the-ground advancement, right? So, for example, the last couple of weeks, they've been basically stuck in the northern part of Kyiv, right? So they've not made really that dramatic of an advancement toward the capital city. So instead, what are they doing? They're resorting to airstrikes, right? And so the attacks, for example, this morning, they went after, like you saw in the video, they went after a residential high-rise building. They went after an underground subway system. In both of these situations, there's no military targets. Right. So what they've been doing is going after civilian targets. And Joseph, what they do by doing that is you are, in essence, instilling fear in the populace. Right. You're sowing seeds of fear that when you see these dramatic images, for example, last week, the horrific attack on Mariupol's maternity hospital. Right. You're going after civilian targets. The calculus on the Russian part is that these attacks on civilians will at some point force the Zelensky government to the table, right? So the idea is that in warfare, you escalate in order to de-escalate. And obviously now there's talks, the US intelligence and the UK intelligence talk about a potential chemical or biological attack against that. If that were to happen, I would not be surprised. Why? Because again, this is the Russian MO. They did that in Syria, and there was no red line. Nobody brought consequences against the Kremlin regime. And so, absolutely, could the Russians deploy chemical or biological weapons? Absolutely, that's not far-fetched at all. So there is a combination of a little bit of frustration because they've not made the kind of military moves that they would have wanted to in the first opening days, opening salvos of the war. But this is a long slog because look, you've got three options. One, Putin capitulates and says, I give up and I'm withdrawing my troops. Number two, that the Zelensky government capitulates and gives in to the Russian demands. Or number three, you have a full-scale on operation where the entire Russian Air Force is engaged and they bring in more troops. Those are the three options. And
George,
my sense is that Russia is not going to capitulate.
and George, to that point, and you note the Russian strategy of essentially trying to demoralize the Ukrainian government, Ukrainian people. What's your sense of the mood on the ground? What's the attitude of the Ukrainian people who remain?
Fierce. They are absolutely fierce because this is, at the end of the day, Joseph, a fight for their freedom, for their land. Today, I spoke to a number of humanitarian volunteers who are, in essence, sandwiched on one end to the west. They are 5 miles away from Russian forces, and to the east is Kyiv, and they're smack dab in the middle. And I said to these volunteers, why are you here? You are less than 5 miles from the Russians. And this lady said with such a fierce determination, this is my land, this is my soil, this is my country. I am willing to die for this country. Keep in mind, Joseph, this is a nation that lived through the Soviet Union and the tyranny of the Soviet Union. They gained independence 30 years ago, and in the last 8-10 years have really experienced a flourishing of democracy. It's a young democracy, but it has flourished. They don't want to go back. They don't want to go back to the Soviet mentality of the USSR. When you have lived through that, why do you want to go back to that?
You make a fair point. And if this is going to be a battle of wills, and it appears that it is, and that's generally what war is, the early indications are that both sides of this conflict are very resolved, which could be the ingredients for a long, drawn out, protracted, painful conflict. But
Yeah.
we also know the headlines this week, the prime ministers of Poland, Slovenia, and Czech Republic are somewhat surprisingly going into a war zone to meet with Zelensky there in Kyiv. What's the significance of this meeting? What do you expect to come of it?
Yeah, let me just backtrack and say, and give you a different point of view in terms of the slog on the Russian part. The Russians don't have a necessarily fight in this in terms of the army. We have seen reports after reports of Russian soldiers basically quitting, being absolutely frustrated that they are involved in this entire war against their fellow brothers and sisters here in Ukraine. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, they have a fight in this. They have a dog in the fight, so they are a little bit more, in my opinion, they have a lot more at stake in terms of these
George.
leaders.
60 seconds. 60 seconds. Want to hear your answer?
Sure. Yeah, it's a show of support in essence, right? It's a show of support, and again, these are Baltic countries that are also very concerned about Russia's creeping initiative and attempts to creep closer to their borders. So clearly, this was a sign of support for the Zelensky government.
Well, we are encouraged by that, and there's so much more to talk about. We are sadly out of time in terms of the support that the rest of the world is giving to Ukraine. Is the world going to unify around that? What does that mean moving forward? George, we're going to have you back, but we thank you for your time, and Godspeed to you and God's protection on you there. What you're doing is so important, but we do hope that you will be safe, and we look forward to talking to you soon. Thank you, George.
Thanks for having me on. Pleasure.